When we went to Walden and visited Thoreau's cabin, we learned that he had 3 chairs. The first chair was for the individual, and it was really awesome to see the individual growth and development of our youth on this pilgrimage. The second chair was for friendship. There were strengthening bonds of friendship and connection that happened throughout our trip. The third chair was for society. We thank you, the congregation, for your many forms of support of our youth on this journey, for participating in our fundraisers, for your love and support on their journey.
Hi, I'm Erica Beecher, one of the other chaperones. I was going to tell you that the week that we spent together in Concord and Boston really deepened my personal faith. It was a privilege to be able to see all the historical sites and hear the stories of the complex figures, as we talked about. I was blessed to be a witness to this trip, both as a parent and as a chaperone. I think that we have an amazingly kind, wicked smart group of respectful young people who went along, and it was my pleasure and my privilege to be part of that trip. One thing I'd like to point out is how consciously inclusive they were with one another. They named observations of racism, they pointed out carbon footprints, and they discussed past or present injustices. So I could not be more proud of you, and you are the reason why my faith has been deepened, so thank you.
At 3:30 a.m., Sunday, August 4th, youth, chaperones, and parents met at the church parking lot. Amid the beams of car lights, hugs were given, parting words were spoken, or mumbled. It was 3 a.m. after all. And then we left on our pilgrimage to Concord, Boston, and the surrounding areas. And this was a pilgrimage, if for no other reason, like countless pilgrims before us and many that will come after us, we walked a lot. We traversed miles a day from one site to another until the flesh proved weaker than the spirit and we ordered an Uber. We hiked around Concord, Boston, Cambridge, and Plymouth. We saw graves and houses and churches, statues, monuments, markers, and at least one large rock. We ate together, we got caught in the rain, and we listened to countless stories. Still, the question remains, why call it a pilgrimage and not just sightseeing or even a history or a heritage trip? It's true that we saw sights. It's also true that we learned about our heritage. But neither the history nor the sights were the primary reason why we went. And to try to boil it down to just souvenir gathering or a fancy history lesson about our past fails to ignore the human connections that were made and the revelations that were had. I use revelation deliberately. I do not mean that some supernatural being spoke to anyone, although Erica Beecher did speak to us, and with as much running as she does in a day, I don't think that's natural. If all we mean by revelation is communication from a supernatural being, then we impoverish the word as well as the world. We realize that the world and the people therein can reveal many things to us if we only put ourselves on the right path. We need to be open to being there, to being ourselves, and to being open. So we go on pilgrimage. For many on this trip, something was revealed, and in true UU fashion, the variety of the where and the how and the what of that revelation came as varied as the various people on the trip. Some, as you will hear, found a connection and a sacredness in the woods of Walden Pond, while others found it in walking into an old church in the heart of Boston. Some found it walking through the halls of Emerson's house, and others still by walking up to a grave. Every insight is unique. Every mode for gaining that insight is valid. They are all different, and some even might conflict, and that is okay. Because the world is vast, perspectives are plural, and the travelers are unique. Yet in this situation, there is something that ties everything together besides walking. There is a strand of Unitarian Universalism that is woven throughout. As we grappled with the questions and controversies that occupied those early American UUs, we found their humanness and their faith. We saw how they at times fell short and yet were bolstered by their communities. So we asked the youth if their faith in this tradition was changed or strengthened through their experience. Now you will hear their reflections and see a photo that each has picked out. Every reflection and every photo is different, and that is as it should be, because to try to point to a single pilgrim path is faulty. But what we find is that there is a path for every pilgrim that dares to take the first step.
Unitarian Universalism. I've grown up in this church, but I've never really gotten the chance to go into depth about Unitarian Universalism and RE. We have mostly focused on other religions. I'm beyond grateful that I got to go on this trip. It's helped me grow and widen my knowledge of what Unitarian Universalism is. People I come in contact with, the topic of religion always seems to come up. I usually get the answer that they're Christian or something along the lines of that. I replied that I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and they rarely know what that is. Here in the Midwest, no one really has ever heard of Unitarian Universalism, and it's kind of awkward for me to try and explain it to people. I rarely ever know how to explain it to them. But going out to the East Coast was a breath of fresh air, because Boston holds the roots of Unitarian Universalism, and it's a known religion. Here in the Midwest, our religion seems frail, but there in Boston, the presence of our religion is amazing and overwhelming. Throughout Boston, everywhere you looked, there was something that led to Unitarian Universalism. And for me personally, I'm a visual learner. Seeing all these churches and being physically there helped me learn the best. Walking through the streets of Boston, there were so many beautiful churches everywhere you looked. Over the years, I've learned about Elizabeth Peabody, Henry David Thoreau, and Clara Barton, but being there helped me feel more connected to them in some type of way, especially when we got to walk to their homes and being to walk through where they once had been. Our church has been around for 150 years, but I didn't get the sense of depth of our religion and how long it's been around that I did gain while I was in Boston. I've chosen this picture because the churches were one of the biggest highlights of the trip for me.
This trip has really secured my faith as being UU. I never knew that such prominent and world-changing people were either Unitarian or Universalist. Going to the burial grounds and cemeteries was very inspiring to be in a place where such amazing people are. Going to the UUA headquarters was very cool, and learning about the history and details that we didn't in RE was nice. Going to Henry David Thoreau's cabin in Walden Pond was a very cool experience because we got to see where he wrote Walden. Going to Ralph Waldo Emerson's house was also an incredible experience to see where he finished his nature. I know that this community and faith are here to stay. And I chose this picture because it shows how, even though that place is really old, the community and city around it still grows and it stays there, just preserved.
History class happens to be my favorite subject in school, but it's a little hard for me to stay awake in it. It's kind of unfortunate. So I often imagine it as like the teacher telling a story. And in history class, I hear about these great famous people. We often think that the people who were so amazing were these exceptional beings that knew everything. Truth is, they aren't much different than us, and I learned that. Some of these people who we thought were so great include Ralph Waldo Emerson, the guy who wrote dozens of essays and gave thousands of lectures and was basically running the town of Concord. Henry David Thoreau, who instead of willingly staying in a cabin in the woods for 2 years, was actually kicked out of the town by Emerson and wrote Walden. Margaret Fuller, the woman who wrote what is considered the first major feminist work called The Women in the 19th Century. Paul Revere, or not just Paul Revere, but Samuel Prescott, Israel Bissell, William Dawes, and Sybil Ludington, who all rode their horses what we now know as the Freedom Trail. William Ellery Channing, a Unitarian preacher who was known for public speeches and prominent thinking and liberal theology of the day. Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women, a book that has never been out of the press. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who is most famously known for his Scarlet Letter. And finally, Elizabeth Peabody, who became a charter member of the Transcendentalist movement, along with other members including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, William Ellery Channing, Louisa May Alcott, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. As I just proved, history is connected. It's a never-ending connected storybook. This trip has helped me realize that. Being there, places where these famous people, but not recognized enough, have stood and lived, it's brought the story to life. For that 1 week in Boston, we were living in the past. And the fact that they were just like us means that we have the capability of doing great things just like them. And with these brave, well-rounded, big-hearted souls that I have around me, I'm sure we're going to do great things to add to it. And this picture that I chose, it's the old City Hall of Boston, and the American flag on it symbolizes the history that I learned on this trip.
Prior to this Boston pilgrimage, I found my faith as Unitarian Universalist not rooted in any God, but rather in good people trying to make the world a better place. I assumed that UUism was always that. But this trip to Boston has opened my eyes to how our faith has a long and rich history, full of unique and different people, all colored in shades of gray. This trip allowed myself and my fellow youth of this church to learn our history while still being together as a fun and welcoming group. We covered way too many miles, was walking as we traveled to Thoreau's cabin, the Alcott House, across the Concord North Bridge, and down the streets of Boston, passing many famous graves such as Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Seeing these places in person made me feel more connected to this church building and the people who came before us. We were also able to visit the Unitarian Universalist Association headquarters and even meet with Susan Frederick Gray, the current president of the UUA. I think that was really cool because I have seen her from afar when I went to GA as a youth delegate. Here, we learned about prevalent Unitarians and Universalists from our history and how they would shape what would become the UUA. While on this trip, the phrase Universalists think God is too good to damn people, and Unitarians think people are too good to be damned was a lighthearted way to differentiate our two religions before they combined. We were able to see the humor here in our history and learn that the people in the stories, in the paintings, and in the graves were just that, imperfect people. By the end of this week-long pilgrimage, my understanding of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist has grown, and I feel that my faith has deepened because of it. And the photo I chose was Henry David Thoreau's grave. I found beauty in the simple artistic nature of it while surrounded by pencils and appreciation gifts from those who know his works.
I believe that my faith has become stronger over the week that I spent on this trip, learning about our faith's history and the people that helped form our religion. We got to go to so many places, and there was so much history in all of them. It was really strange and cool to see where these people actually lived and worked, learning about what they went through just because of what they believed in. Elizabeth Peabody was, I believe, ahead of her time. She had so many ideas that were considered radical, but we have her to thank for kindergarten and honestly still most of the school system that we know today. Learning about the good and the bad of UU history, learning that they were just people. Imperfect, messy people. To say that we got along the entire time would be a lie. But you're sticking 10 teenagers together and having them spend just about all day together. Don't get me wrong, I'll love the time that we spent in Boston and Concord. All the memories and moments that we had, I will always look back with fondness. I don't think the group could have been more perfect, because we all basically grew up with one another. We were already family, and this trip have all strengthened our bond. It was truly such a fun trip. Thank you for making it possible. And the picture that I chose was how big Boston really is and how small you can feel surrounded by these enormous buildings.
I feel that my faiths and beliefs have been strengthened by this Boston trip because I was able to see how our founders upheld and supported their beliefs, even if it meant closing down your school and teaching from a basement just because others don't believe that everyone should get an equal education, no matter their color, beliefs, or life choices. I learned that Bronson Alcott started the temple school in the upper story of the Boston Masonic Lodge. Many well-to-do families enrolled their students at the school, with Bronson Alcott and Elizabeth Peabody teaching the students. One day, Bronson Alcott enrolled a black girl to the school. Many of the families threatened to pull out their children if they didn't kick out the black girl out of the school. Rather than give in to the parents' demands, Bronson Alcott continued to educate the girl. The parents withdrew their students, forcing him to start teaching out of a basement. The school shortly closed after that. And I don't believe that we would have gotten all of the rich knowledge that we got on this trip if it weren't for our awesome chaperones. Derek with his seemingly endless knowledge and awe-inspiring insight. Erica with enthusiasm and indirect parenting. Luke with his caffeine-inspired energy. And Kim with their good friendship and encouraging smiles. I feel that we both grew together and apart because each of us found different meaning in all of the teachings we received. One lesson I personally found was that not all leaders are up in front. Some leaders are pushing from the back, inspiring others as they go along. With this pilgrimage, we saw the roots that turned into the great thriving tree that is UUism today. And I'm proud to be a leaf among many branches.
On this trip, I've gotten to connect with fellow UUs. Friendships within the youth group have strengthened, and it's nice to know that we're part of a larger group of people who share our values. While my faith in UUism has grown stronger, my faith in the UU community is what's really grown. The things our ancestors did and fought for was inspiring, and learning about the tight-knit community they all had meant a lot. Exploring other UU churches and touring the UUA headquarters, you can really see the threads connecting us all, no matter how thin they may be. The example that most sticks in my mind was the woman who took us on the tour of the UUA headquarters. A few minutes into the tour, she was explaining a plaque with three important figures, one of whom had been enslaved. She pointed out that she had said he was an enslaved man rather than a slave, because calling him a slave made that his entire identity. It was a nice reminder that we're an accepting community, that we try to make everyone comfortable with being themselves with us, and that we don't judge a book by its cover. Not only has this trip made me appreciate the community we've created, but it made me closer to the youth and to our minister. Our nightly reflections let us share our thoughts and feelings about topics I feel we normally wouldn't have had the opportunity to talk about. Kim really made an effort to help us connect during these reflections, and I thank her greatly for that. I feel she did a wonderful job and posed questions that made a lot of us think. Luke, we realized, is ridiculously philosophical and really good at putting his thoughts into really meaningful words, so he shared last the rest of the trip. Another thing about Luke is he never had a backpack like the rest of us did, but he was always prepared for everything. He had a coffee in his hands that never seemed to run out. He had Band-Aids in his wallet for blisters. When it started pouring, his poncho literally just appeared out of nowhere. Mom joked that it might have been a power he got as a minister, but seriously, how? So this picture is the sign for the UUA headquarters.
I don't really consider it strengthening my faith rather than it just grew. It grew. Concord showed me how massively the U's contributed to it and just how much Hawthorne, Emerson, Peabody, and Thoreau, and all these people actually, were connected with it, such as Thoreau's thoughts on ethical, environmental, and societal problems, Emerson's ideological thoughts on nature and humans, and Peabody with the school district, with kindergarten. She brought kindergarten to the U.S. The Alcotts did also try to make a utopian society. It was short-lived. It was pretty good. Yeah. Picture. Yes, the picture. The picture basically reminded me of something. It reminded me of a cabin I stayed in with my grandparents at one time.
If you plan on heading to Boston anytime soon, one thing I recommend is to always bring a pair of good walking shoes. During the Boston trip, I experienced an understanding of our UU heritage, enjoyed beautiful sights of the city of Boston and Concord, and along the way built closer relationships with friends and chaperones. We traveled most places on foot, and we quickly discovered that good shoes were a big necessity. However, the sore feet and blisters were worth it. We visited the houses of Emerson and Thoreau, and I learned that Thoreau lived in the Walden Woods for 2 years, 2 months, 2 days, to have a better understanding of his life. I really enjoyed visiting this area because we were immersed in the forest with great big trees hanging above us and the pond in view. I felt my own connection to Thoreau as his ideas because of my own love of nature. One of the days, we visited a graveyard, and I felt a feeling of awareness, listening to the quiet noises around me as we walked in silence. This made me think of why we are here and where we go after we die, as well as the idea that we could potentially have our own group of people coming to visit our grave, learning our life lessons and life stories. These experiences have inspired me to think more about my own beliefs and lessons and how I can share them with others and inspire them the way Thoreau inspires me. As we visited these historic places, I felt my faith in Unitarian Universalism deepen as I felt a connection to these people and places. I learned that there are more UUs in the world than I originally thought, and the loving and inclusive nature of them makes me proud to be a part of this church. And my picture today is of Maria and I when we were visiting Thoreau's house in the woods.
We had one young man join us on our pilgrimage whose family moved away over the summer. He was an integral part of our group on pilgrimage. We hold him in our hearts, and we wanted him to be here with us today, so we've asked him to record his reflection. So, Alec Walls Flanagan.
My Unitarian Universalist faith has been deepened by this trip, by seeing the places where Unitarian Universalist history was made, and by learning about the real people behind that history who made it. Because we always learn about the amazing things that people do, but rarely do we learn about their human side of the story. Ralph Waldo Emerson is a good example of this. While I had always known him to be a significant essayist and Unitarian, I learned during this trip much more about him and his faults. He brought together most of the American transcendentalists of the time and gave them financial aid in Concord. He was also one of the most famous transcendentalists at the time for his essays such as Nature. But he also had his faults. He didn't always follow the values that he outlined in Nature, and he helped fund John Brown's Bloody Crusade. Elizabeth Peabody is another interesting transcendentalist. She did many great things in her lifetime, including introducing kindergarten to the U.S., helping pioneer Montessori in the U.S., fighting for Native American rights, and sheltering immigrants in her home. She also played an important role in publishing some of the early UU writings, such as she was the first to publish an essay on civil disobedience and many other transcendentalist writings like Genius. But she also had her faults. She was quite stubborn and strong-willed, which did allow her to do many things in her life, though. But more importantly, she once sat on a kitten. This is what really deepened my UU faith of the trip, learning the non-romanticized human version of these people's stories.
So you've heard some testimony from these youth, and that Elizabeth Peabody sat on a kitten, but she did many other good things. One place we also gathered, we tried to sing a couple times. One was in Arlington Street Church. The other was at First Church Boston, which is the oldest church in Boston. It was founded in 1630, almost 400 years ago. And we gathered in the entrance in a stone dome, and we sang the song, the words we could remember at least, of Blue Boat Home. I invite you, as you're comfortable, to join a hand next to you or place your hand on your heart. Breathe deep the breath of life. We gather in a long line of stories, of values, of imperfect people, just like us. These are the stories of our people because they do not set in one time and one space. These stories are also our stories, and we make of them what comes next. May it be so. Amen.